There's more action from the US Championships. It's round 5. It's the game Hans Niemann against Levon Aronjan. And you are definitely gonna enjoy this one, as Hans is having a great tournament so far. He has 2.5 out of 4, is only half a point behind the tournament leader Fabiano Caruana. And now he's playing his first 2700 plus player from the event. It's Levon Aronjan. And let's see what's happening in this game. If you're interested in following the tournament, make sure to subscribe to the channel, as there are some fantastic players participating, great games are being played, and of course you want to see the latest updates on the improvement of Hans Niemann. He starts with 1 e4, and after c5, knight f3, e6, we have a Sicilian. Is Hans going to play the open variation? No, he is going for the move c3. It's the Alapin line. And after the move d5, well, most people just capture the pawn on d5 and will follow it up with d4 very soon. But Hans just played in the World Juniors in Mexico just a week before this event started, and he got an idea from a game played over there, and he decided to play the move e5. This is a move which exists already for quite a period of time, and the idea is that if black is going to develop with knight c6, we just have a transposition to the advanced variation of the French. This is well-known theory, but this is something most Sicilian players, they don't like it. You get a more blocked type of structure. So this is a first small surprise by Hans. And Aronjan doesn't want to play the French. He goes for the move d4 himself, preventing white from placing the pawn on d4. And now we have to come up with an alternative plan. The move d3 is played, knight e7, and white goes g3. This is the idea. You can no longer develop your bishop to an active square like c4 because the pawn on d3 is blocking the bishop. So the bishop is on its way to g2. And well, there are various possibilities here. The main continuation is to go knight bc6, followed by knight g6, queen c7. And well, there are various ideas here. White's going to play bishop g2, queen e2, and well, interesting line. Definitely at some point we'll have a closer look at the ins and outs. But let's see what Aronjan played, because it seems to me that he was still kind of familiar with his position, and he decided to take on c3. It's not a move I like the most. I like this advanced pawn on d4, and after b takes c3, white is getting the chance to support the center again. Bishop d7 played, and after bishop g2, white is looking for ways to cause some damage on this long diagonal. You would expect the black bishop to come to c6, but first bishop b5. This is the idea of black's play, to attack the pawn on d3 with both the bishop and the queen. So the pawn goes to c4, bishop back to c6, castling kingside, and now knight f5. So there's this nice hole on the d4 square. White goes with the bishop to b2, so the pawn on e5 gets supported as well. Bishop e7, and now queen e2. I think this is all kind of normal, but the question is, how is black going to complete its development? What are you going to do with the king? Are you going to castle kingside? That's one idea. Well, other plan, and one source of concern here is, what are you going to do with that knight? And I would have expected here black to take on f3, so that after bishop takes back, you put a queen on d7 to protect the pawn, and next move you want to play knight c6 and put a rook on the d file, and you have pressure against the backward pawn on d3. There's a nice square for one of your knights on d4, and I would say the position is more or less balanced. But Aronjan played here surprising move h5. He wants to secure the knight on f5 so that it cannot be kicked away with the move g4 anytime. But there's an additional plan, because after the move knight bd2, black even advances the pawn to h4. Very aggressive play, looking for ways to generate some activity on the king side. And white has the possibility to kick the knight out with g4. So the knight looks as if it has to go, but maybe Hans didn't like this move h3, which leads to a very messy position and an open king side. Maybe it's not bad for white at all, but there's no need allowing it. And instead, Hans played here the move knight e4. I like this move from a practical point of view, I think it's very, very sensible to centralize the knight. And what is black going to do with its h-pawn? You can advance it to h3, but as long as the bishop is on this diagonal, I don't see any clear benefits having the pawn there. There are no mating threats at all. So Aronjan goes for h takes g3. He's investing quite an amount of moves here with its h-pawn to trade it off. And now, how would you recapture? You can take back with a h-pawn, with a knight, but Hans recaptures with a third option, f takes g3. Taking away from the center with the purpose of opening up the f-file for the rook. And also the second rank is nicely cleared, so there are no any dangers on the h-file. Bishop takes e4 played, queen takes e4 with the idea so that the knight can come into to c6. And now, looks as if black is in control. You can go queen d7, put a rook on d8, maybe castle queenside. But Hans seizing the initiative with the next move, g4. I think that's a nice idea. You would like to get rid of the knight on f5. If the knight would go away to h4, knights can get swapped, and then the rook comes to f3 with the plan of doubling on the f-file, and white is much better placed in the center with nice control, bishop pair, open, half open f-file for the rook. So that's something black didn't really fancy at all. And instead, after g4, Aronjan went for knight d4, but there's bishop takes d4, and you can never really take back with a knight because it hangs the pawn on b7. So c takes d4 was played, but now with that pawn on d4, you no longer have this option to place a piece on that d4 square. The pressure against the backward pawn on d3 is gone. White goes rook a b1, and white is the one putting pressure now against the pawn on b7. Queen c7 played, and Hans continues with the move g5. Maybe his idea is to go g6 next. That's something black doesn't like. Played here the move g6, but it also gives away a square on f6, I would say. And there are various interesting moves. I like queen f4 so that you're hitting the pawn on f7. There are later plans to get a knight around, maybe to e4, so that it can come to d6 or maybe even f6. Well, you got to think about that pawn on e5, so possibly the rook can even come to e1, supporting that pawn on e5 before. But Hans had a different idea. He played h4, also understandable, to protect the pawn on g5. And here I think Aronjan goes for the wrong plan, because I think he underestimates the danger being exerted by the bishop and queen on this long diagonal. In particular, this pawn on b7 is not it's a bit problematic. And a standard way of playing would be rook c8 to get out of the diagonal, overprotecting the knight on c6, and you're planning to go b6 next, so that it takes away the pressure and the knight is nicely defended. But instead, Aronjan played bishop to b4. It's closing the b-file for the white rook. But now the knight comes to h2, castling queenside, and now the rook goes to b3. So the plan is that you are going to double on the b-file. And okay, maybe I went a little too fast here. You don't have to castle queenside, but are you really going to castle kingside? That's also not something you really like, because the knight will come into g4. That looks very, very dangerous, and the pawn on e5 cannot be taken as the bishop would be hanging. So therefore, castling queenside, rook b3, bishop to d2. This was black's idea. After rook fb1, there is a check on e3, but the king comes to f1. This bishop is absolutely not causing any problems. And the main threat here is just to take on b7, eliminating the two defenders, the pawn on b7 and the queen on c7, the defenders of that knight on c6. If you overprotect it with a rook, you still can take on b7, and you cannot really get two rooks for the queen, because once you recapture, the knight on c6 can be taken and it's game over. Therefore, black is in big trouble. He had to go for the move b6. He's sacrificing its knight with allowing queen takes c6. Now after the exchange of queens, the idea is there's rook takes h4. So black is looking for counterplay against the knight. There are various weak pawns. But first, the knight comes back. to hit the rook. Rook g4. And now rook e1. Hans is playing an excellent move. He wants to get rid of this bishop, because if not, rook h8 with counter-attacking ideas against the king. It could even some sort of mating ideas sometimes. With rook e1, rook h8, you're just giving back the material. With rook takes e3, this is an excellent idea, so that after d takes e3, you put a king on e2. And everything is under control. The bishop is working back in defense as well. It protects the knight. After rook h3, you put the bishop on e4. That's a nice and simple move. Rook g2 check. Questioning what the king is going to do. Of course, the king is going to capture the pawn. By doing that, black can also take the pawn on g5, because the knight on f3 is pinned. The king goes back to f2, but now it's rook to g4. And, well, if we do the material count, we see that white has 4 pawns, black has 5, so it's knight and bishop versus rook and pawn. But I like the cooperation of these pieces. And I think this is an important moment, because I think with a move like rook b1, the rook goes back. I think the rook needs to consolidate its position. And later on, if you get a chance here to play a4, maybe to go knight d4, there's no counterplay against the white king. Maybe it's just one check. But the idea is to get a knight to b5 and attack the pawn, or maybe the knight can come to c6 actually as well. I think white is technically winning, but Hans had a different idea. He wanted to play actively with its rook. After rook a3, king b8, protecting the pawn, the rook went to a6. What is he doing? I really didn't get the idea here at all. Black goes g5, looking for some counterplay, maybe with rook f4 and then g4. But still, you may be able to break with a move like c5 and then try to win the pawn back. But to me, this doesn't seem very obvious. I'm thinking this is looking strange, actually. But Hans went for knight d4, rook f4 check played, king goes to e2. And now it's rook h2, king e3, rook h3. Is possibly a repetition of moves. It's move 40, additional time on the clock now. Black is giving another check. Black is happy to make a draw here. But the king walks away to the queen side, getting out of the checks. Is this pawn dangerous? Well, that's not really the question. White is about to go knight c6 and take the pawn on a7. That was part of white's strategy. Black has only one move, and Aronjan finds it. He plays the move rook takes e4, eliminating one of the key attackers, as well as a great defender of this pawn on the g file. After d takes e4, the g pawn comes up the board. The king needs to come back to try to stop the pawn. And, well, what should black do? Definitely, the best move here, it was not played in the game, it's the move g3. So you're about to go g2. If you play a move like king e3, then g2, king f2, it's not a problem. You first got to move your rook to the other side so that the king cannot approach the pawn any further. If you go knight f3, then the pawn comes to g2. And this is not easy at all, because how are you going to attack the pawn? There are a lot of weak pawns which the rook can target as well. And there are serious drawing chances here. Because if you attempt to go around with your king, to go king g3, there is rook f2 and the knight is pinned. So you're threatening to create a new passed pawn yourself. This is probably the way to save the game for black. But it didn't happen. Instead, Aronjan played the move rook f2. He wanted to cut off the king along the f-file. But now after king e3, g3 doesn't make too much sense. It runs into knight e2, and you cannot push the pawn because of king takes f2. In the game there followed rook f1, king e2, rook f4. The rook stays on the f-file. But now, nice move, rook a3. The rook comes back in defense, and after rook takes e4, it's just the move king d3. You're attacking the rook and protect the knight. Rook e1. Now the knight comes back into defense, stopping the g-pawn, controlling this square. King b7. There's not much else black can do. Now it's king d2, and the rook will come back in defense as well. If you go for a move like rook h1, you just bring the rook and everything is okay. You just make sure that you keep as many pawns on the board, not allowing any potential pawn trades. In the game that followed, rook a1, the rook went to the other side to prevent this rook from going away. But there is another brilliant move by Hans, knight c1. And the knight overprotects the pawn. If you play here the move g3, well, you may just take the pawn on g3, but much better even is the move king c2. When you're about to go king b2 and the rook is trapped, if you go g2, it's rook g3, the pawn is stopped, the rook cannot go anywhere, king b2 on the next move, and it's game over. Therefore, rook b1 had to be played, but now it's rook to g3, and white's pawns are absolutely safe. Rook b2 check, king c3 attacking the rook, rook f2, rook takes g4. It's a knight against the pawn and it's technically winning. You just got to be precise. Black played a5, white goes a4 so that the knight can move away, so that the pawn on a2 is never hanging. Rook f1, knight e3, rook a1 attacking this pawn on a4, but we are going after the other pawn on f7. Rook a3, king d4, rook takes a4, rook takes f7, rook c8, oh sorry, king c8, and now we can go after the pawn on e6. Very nice technique by Hans. He's not minding this move b5, so that the pawn on c4 is pinned. After knight takes e6, you can take the pawn on c4 with check, but after king d5, this pawn on e5 is way too strong. You can play the move a4, but rook a7, the pawns are nicely controlled. You can even go rook a5 next to attack the pawn on b5. After rook c1, the knight went to d4, and Aronjan had seen enough, because next is the move e6, e7, maybe king d6 is just a game over. The e-pawn is way stronger than black's two connected passed pawns. So this is a brilliant victory of Hans Niemann over a super grandmaster, former number 2 in the world, Levon Aronjan. I thought this was a very exciting game, and Hans, he's still in sole second place, half a point behind Fabiano Caruana, who managed to win his game with the black pieces against Andrew Tang. I think Hans is in great shape, and does he have a chance to win the tournament? Let me know what you think, or is just Fabiano still the clear favorite? I'm curious to see what's going to happen in the next couple of rounds. Let's see together what's going to happen, and more coverage on this channel, of course. See you soon.